All right. I have experience with IGCSE and the A levels as well. In regards to the IGCSEs, I do have experience teaching a variety of different depth studies, which include Germany, the USA, and the First World War. In regards to the A levels, I do have experience teaching two different options, both the international and the US options for both AS and A2. I'm going to begin by going over what are going to be the topics discussed during this webinar. One of the first topics we're going to begin discussing is going to be support with teaching and learning in an online environment. Perhaps from some of you might struggle with, well, how do I go about this? What activities can I plan? How do I plan a lesson? How do I deliver this lesson? And I hope that the advice I can give will be very beneficial. Now, the next topic we're going to be discussing is going to be assessing students in an online classroom, right? How do we give them the assessments? Which assessments do we choose, right? And also, how do we provide feedback for them, since feedback is so essential to the learners improving. And one of the last things we'll be discussing is ideas for best practices, particularly with bridging your online learning to returning to school. Since some of you may be in a situation where you begin the school year online, but then you steadily go back to teaching in a classroom setting. Now, in regards to the following slides, what you'll notice is that most slides do not have history-specific content. However, when I reach a certain point, I will interject and give ideas and advice about how this might look like in a history class. So let's begin with teaching and learning online. Now, I want to begin by talking about what are some of the challenges that for teachers with online learning is motivation and engagement. Perhaps that when you were designing a lesson, this lesson was quite incredible. You're like, wow, I have all the right activities. However, during the online experience, you'll notice that your students are not really motivated. They're not engaged as much as you want to. So we're going to kind of discuss ways to try to solve this challenge. Another challenge that you might experience is the lack of contact that is essential for assessment for learning. When you're teaching in a classroom, sometimes when you're going over difficult content or challenging content, you're going to notice simply by the expressions on the student's face whether or not he or she fully understands it. So how do we assess them so that we can know that they are learning while in the online environment? Another major challenge when it comes to online learning is developing independence. Now, depending on where you teach and the culture of the students, some students may be passive learners. So they usually prefer the teacher taking the lead, and they feel that they learn more effectively using a more like a didactic approach. Another challenge that you may experience with online learning is technological issues. Well, is my connectivity stable? Are they able to hear me? Are there issues with the volume? Things like that. Maybe the student can't connect. And these are issues that you might experience during online learning that could impact teaching and learning. Now, the last one I want to mention is probably even just the uncertainty of how to run an online class. For some teachers, perhaps using technology isn't something that you usually did before. And now that you have to teach online, you're kind of thrown into a very uncomfortable and new situation. So hopefully the advice that I follow in this webinar will really help you out in terms of preparing for online teaching and learning. One of the first things I want to discuss is planning, okay, how to plan. My first advice to this is when you're planning a lesson, focus less on lecturing content. And the reason I say this is because if your online lesson is mostly about lecturing content, then you will lose the interest of the students. You will see a lack of motivation, and also they will not feel that they can engage with you. So I do recommend that when you are planning a lesson, don't design a lesson objective that kind of forces you to lecture. So I want to actually give you some examples of what a poorly designed lesson objective could be. So for example, IGCSE, perhaps you're looking at chapter 2, and your lesson objective is to learn about the Corfu incident, right? Well, it's not very clear what particularly you want students to be able to achieve towards the end of this lesson. If you're an A-level teacher teaching perhaps the A2 US option, maybe your lesson objective here would be to learn about the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Well, that's a very broad topic with lots of information, individuals, and it would be very challenging to have a lesson objective to solely be to learn about that. Which kind of leads us to the next point about using an LMS, a learning management system, to really help you flip these lessons, okay? In regards to what is available online, there are a number of different learning management systems that you can use. For example, I have myself used Edmodo in the past, Schoology. Some schools use Canvas, others have implemented blended learning using Moodle. So there are a lot of different programs that you can use in order to manage learning, put resources online for students, and a place where you can kind of have many resources for them, but also post assignments and also be able to give them feedback. Now, in regards to flipping the lesson, what we're really looking at here is that students come to your online lesson kind of already prepared. They previewed material, and now in the lesson, we'll be able to connect that to some key skills that they really need to improve on in order to be successful in the Cambridge assessments. This is going to lead us to the next point, which is about focus more on key skills, okay? Now, I gave you a few examples here, such as evaluating arguments, deconstructing political cartoons, reading comprehension with text-based sources, or even writing comparisons, okay? Now, in regards to, let's go back to what I said about some examples of not effective lesson objectives, all right? So let's look at an IGCSE history topic. We said before, a not very clear objective is learn about the Corfu incidents. Well, maybe instead for an online lesson, a more effective learning objective will be to identify the key points or the main points in a text-based source. And the text-based source that you're going to be using is one related to the Corfu incident. And this kind of connects to the next point on the list of the slide, which is when you're using sources, you should be selecting sources that reinforce the content that students are learning. Another example of a lesson you can do, again, using Corfu incident as the example here, is even identifying symbols in political cartoons and being able to understand what they represent. And this is another very key paper 2 skill that students need to acquire in order to do well. Now notice for that example, again, you're not lecturing the content of the Corfu incident in the lessons. However, students are going to reinforce their understanding of this historical event by focusing on other skills. If you're an A-level teacher, again, going back to the US option example I gave before about learning about the civil rights movement in the 1950s, well, that's quite broad. Instead, focus on a clear skill that's very important for an A2 history learner. For example, analyze if Martin Luther King Jr. is the central figure of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. This is going to make students really start to think out of the box about the different leaders who are there in the 1950s involved in this event in different sections of the country. So I do recommend these approaches when you're teaching an online lesson. Focus a lot less on lecturing content, finding material that reinforces the content, but also for the very high levels, such as AS and A2, find different ways to focus on the skills that are analyzation and evaluation. Now, the next thing I want to discuss is how do you deliver an online lesson? Now, this is where teachers, you have to find something that works for you. I firmly believe that creating effective routines that your students can identify and get used to will make online learning very effective. For example, when students enter the class for online learning, perhaps you have like an entry ticket, perhaps you have a do it now activity, or even perhaps you are implementing an active learning strategy, such as See, Think, Wonder. These having a very clearly planned out lesson, similarly to how you would have a lesson in the class, is going to be very important to make sure that students are activating prior knowledge and that they're engaged. Now, I also have here's the next point, make instructions simple and clear. And I think this is true whether or not the lesson is online or whether the lesson is in person. But to make online teaching more effective, keep things simple, make it clear. And you're gonna notice an improvement in your students' motivation and engagement in the class. They know what is expected of them and they know what to do. The next point I want to discuss is allowing and encouraging dialogue to take place. What happens, and it kind of goes back to what I said in the previous slide about avoid lecturing. Now, when you encourage dialogue, this is where now students are engaged, okay? They're able to add to the learning process here in this online lesson. An example of something that I used when I was doing online lessons was actually speaking out loud essays. For example, perhaps we are working on a paper 2 for IGCSE, a compare and contrast response. Well, actually, I would give students some time to think about the sentences they want to write. And then one by one, we will actually build an essay together where students would read out the sentences they wrote. And this is a really great way to get them to speak out loud and to really make them feel a part of the class. Another activity that can also be very effective for you is actually a mini debate, which is actually very compatible with online learning, since you, as the host of the online lesson, are able to mute some students or even allow some students audio or video to be shared. Now, I think the mini debate is very important, linking to the history curriculum for both IGCSE and even for A level, because if you look at some of the C questions for paper 1 for IGCSE, if you look at the B questions for paper 2 AS, if you look at the questions you'll see in A2, paper 4, a lot of these are asking students to understand arguments from different perspectives, or even try to evaluate the importance of factors in the causation of an event. So for example, if you're an IGCSE teacher and you're looking at the peace treaties from 1919 to 22, right? Are these treaties fair, right? It's a very easy debate to be able to manage on an online class setting. The same thing with the topic of German criticisms of the Treaty of Versailles, right? Well, how justified are these criticisms? Very simple and very easy for a teacher to be able to organize a mini debate online, giving students a standard amount of time to voice their replies. Next, we're going to talk about what tools can you use for an online lesson. Now, I feel that the next 2 points, this really depends on you as a teacher. What do you prefer? And also, what do your students prefer based on feedback they gave you about your online lesson? So for example, here at the next point, I have here using a drawing pad. Now, for some teachers, perhaps you did purchase a drawing pad and you have used it. Perhaps you have even linked your iPad where you'll be able to use a smart pen and write on the iPad itself for students to see what you're writing. Some teachers do like this tool and have found it to be very successful. So I think it's about you trying it and seeing what you liked. Particularly for myself, with my students. Most of my students preferred when I was actually screen sharing a Word or a Pages document to keep track of a discussion. So the same way that right now in this webinar, I'm screen sharing to a PPT slide, I would instead be screen sharing a Word document. And as we are discussing a topic, for example, even making an essay plan for AS paper 2B question, we will be making this plan together and they'll be able to see the notes that I'm writing down based on feedback that they're giving me, okay? So I think the tools that you use are really going to depend more on what are your preferences, but also what do your students like as well? Because no matter what, we are trying to improve their learning and we have to also take their preferences into consideration at times. The next point I put here about delivering an online lesson is make sure you allow time for reflection, okay? And this is something that's very important for learning, whether it's in the classroom or whether it's online. Having students completing KWL charts, this is something that can be done in the LMS system where you have one that's running. Students can go back to it, can add it to it, and it can upload, and you're able to post replies to it. Or even using the RAG rating, red, amber, green. Maybe the RAG rating might be more challenging in an online class, particularly for like assessment for learning, right? Do you really understand what's happening in this discussion? Instead, be a little creative, have a little fun, right? You can even allow students to use emojis instead of the RAG, right? The red, amber, or green lights. So these are some advice I have for reflection, and also a little bit of tips on assessment for learning to be able to have a quick little formative assessment if the students are understanding the lesson and following you clearly. Moving on, we're going to talk about what are resources available to you, okay? If all of you are working in a Cambridge endorsed school, then you have access to the School Support Hub. On the School Support Hub, you have access to past paper, teaching and learning resources that give you advice, and also schemes of work that give you examples of a lot of lessons that you can use in your classrooms. Now, I do recommend, though, when it comes to teaching, whether it's online or in person, create your own materials, okay? Because no matter what, you are the person who knows your students the best, and you can tailor materials to meet the specific needs of the students. One thing that I did quite often while we were teaching online last spring was I made a lot of videos of myself modeling skills. Now, when I talk about modeling skills, I'm talking about what are some skills that they need to do well in the assessments. So for example, in history, whether it's IGCSE or A-level, essay writing is so essential. So I made small videos breaking apart different responses that they have to learn, right? How do you write a compare contrast response for paper 2, right? How do I answer the question, why was this source published in? When you're getting to the C questions, right? How do I evaluate the arguments and perspectives? And I think what happens is when you make these videos modeling the skills, this is going to be a very valuable resource later on when you return to school. So later in this webinar, I will connect back to this point about making video resources where you model some of the skills and also some of the higher level thinking order that's going to be essential for them. The last one I put here is record videos or even produce materials that help explain challenging content. Now, this last point here goes back to something I said in the beginning of the webinar, and that is try not to lecture about content during your online lesson. These videos where you're really trying to show these connections, this is going to be important to helping students understand things that they might find very challenging. So actually, I would like to give you an example of something that I know from the past my students found very challenging. Now, when I was teaching A2, the international option, a lot of times students are going to be presented to big picture questions in paper 4. One of them that I would like to use as an example is, to what extent was the globalization of the Cold War from 1950 to 1975 caused by the American policy of containment? Now, for students who are studying in A2, chances are the textbooks and the materials that you are using are actually not making these connections clear, nor are they perhaps even focusing on like the globalization as a topic. Perhaps they're learning about individual events. They learn about the Korean War. They learn about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what happens here is that sometimes, especially at the higher levels, students might have a difficult time being able to establish those connections where, well, perhaps the Cold War globalized for a couple of different reasons. I remember we were studying about the Cuban Missile Crisis and why that took place, but I didn't think of it in the bigger context of the Cold War being globalized. This is where producing a video where you are explaining these connections and explaining these different factors, at least this bigger idea, can be very beneficial for your students. Okay, moving on, I want to talk about assessing students, and we're going to begin with designing assessments, okay? So what assessments are most effective, especially when it comes to preparing your students for the IGCSE and the A-level assessments, right? Well, history, this is a essay writing heavy subject. And there are a lot of different things that you can do in terms of developing assessments that are going to be good for them. For example, if you're towards the end of a year and students have already learned a lot of their main skills, giving students full essays to write could be effective. Essay planning is something that I found particularly effective. I also found essay planning something very easily to do online with students as for some lessons. But also it's also effective to give a student a specific section of an essay to write, instead of perhaps writing a full essay. And this is where you can use differentiation. Perhaps a student you know is showing a bit more in one area than other students. You can pinpoint the weaknesses of your individual students and have them write only certain sections of a response instead of writing a full one. Next, I want to talk about assessments related to specific skills. Not all the skills that we need to teach students always require writing immediately. So for example, with paper 2, before they can even begin to write about what's the message of the cartoon, they need to learn about political cartoons. They need to learn how to identify these symbols and how to understand these symbols. For example, even when using text-based sources, right? How do we analyze the reliability of this? So you can create assessments that are linked specifically to some skills that don't always require writing immediately. The last point I want to mention is guided reading questions. And I think this is especially true for English language learners. I personally feel that reading comprehension is usually one of the overlooked skills when you're looking at IGCSE paper 2, AS paper 1, and even A2 paper 3. What happens is if you look at a lot of the mark schemes for these 3 papers, most of these mark schemes have evaluation at the top, right? Where if you want to reach this top level, you usually need to evaluate in arguments, except for paper 3, which is a little different because based on historiography. But however, despite evaluating, if the student does not comprehend what he or she read, then they will still struggle and they might not even be able to achieve the marks in that top band. So I do think that guided reading questions is something that is very essential for developing reading comprehension skills for your learners, especially in the first years that you're working with them, the first year of IGCSE and also the first year of AS, because for some schools, studying IGCSE history is not compulsory to jump into an AS history classroom. If I can give an example of how important reading comprehension is, particularly with paper 3, there was a past paper where the historian outlines an entire argument, but then in the middle of the extract, he introduced a very simple sentence, but this is not so. Very simple sentence, but has such profound impact in terms of the student realizing that any argument or any information provided before was actually the historian introducing another argument that is not necessarily his or her own. So again, reading comprehension is very important, and I recommend a way to improve that with students is by having guided reading questions, which can be done using an LMS system to enhance online learning. Now, what are some alternative assessments that you can use besides focusing on the paper skills and the paper assessments? Well, here are some examples of assessments I think are actually very compatible with online learning. For example, so you could have students record presentations or even give presentations using Zoom or Tencent Meeting, the same way that we are hosting this webinar right now. I put next making a mini documentary, which could be very challenging and it could be very time consuming, depending on your teaching schedule and how many lessons you have. But I do want to point out that there was an activity I did do last spring that was very successful, and it's actually the Family History Project. What I did here, I did this with AS students, where I wanted them to interview and record an interview with family members. And they had to try to connect key events that we were learning in the specific chapter we're studying to what was happening in your family's life at that time. For AS international option, since I live in mainland China, we actually cover the chapter for China-Japan, which is now going to be chapter 4 for the new syllabus. And it's a really great way for them to kind of connect what is happening in this history to what was happening in their families' lives at that time. And it's a really fascinating way to actually make history real for the students. Now, so that's kind of an example of an activity that you could be doing with students so that they can understand the events and they could connect it to other things as well. If you're wondering, well, how can that fit into an online lesson? Well, perhaps it might be too challenging, for example, to view each student's recording on an online lesson. However, it could be posted to the LMS. And the learning management system can be used the same way that teachers go through online training for certificates and other course training events. You can have students reply, make comments on each student's video or post, and have students even reply to comments that other students make, which is something that they will experience in their future as well when they leave our schools, enter university, and even later in life entering the workforce when they also need to do online training. Another activity I put here for the next one is recording a radio news story. This is one that I think was actually very successful in terms of helping students really and truly comprehend what is happening in key events. This was very successful in IGCSE history classes. For example, the Berlin blockade, right? Imagine that you are there at the time when this is happening. You're working for a radio news station, and now you have to report this event. Another example is the Munich Agreement, okay? This event has captivated the world at this time. Fears that a war is gonna break out. The agreement was reached. You are working for a radio station. You now have to broadcast this story. And these are great ways for students to get motivated, get excited, and actually really delve into the topics. One thing I noticed with a lot of these type of projects is that students tend to memorize this information far better and retain it far better than they ever would have if you lectured it. Next, infographics. Now, I want to talk about infographics and note-taking formats in general. I find particularly when it comes to first year history students, whether it's IGCSE or whether it's AS, that one of the key skills we need to teach students is how they can organize the information they're taking from the textbook in a way that they can understand and later be able to deploy. And this is quite a challenge, especially if you're an English language learner. You're entering a history class and you have a lot of words in front of you that are very unfamiliar. So I think that using infographics, using mind maps, teaching students different note-taking formats are actually great ways to kind of get them to break down the information to ways that are effective for them to understand. And it's also very easy to share in an online learning environment if you're using a learning management system. The last one I have here is creating your own political cartoon, and I put this here particularly for IGCSE history teachers. When the students are learning about political cartoons, I highly recommend you give them the chance to make their own, because then they'll actually have to reverse the order for the political cartoon, where now they're thinking, what message do I want to give the audience, right? And then they're thinking about, how am I going to design it? What images are going to put where, right? What symbols am I going to put? So it kind of reverses the thinking order for political cartoons when you're teaching them how to understand them for the paper 2 skill. Moving on, we're going to talk about giving feedback to students. Now, I do recommend with online learning that you find alternative ways or alternatives to written feedback, because written feedback can sometimes be misinterpreted and other times it can sound quite harsh. And for this, I do recommend that you even toy with the idea of using software to record verbal feedback. Now, this could actually be quite simple for you to do. With a smartphone, most of them have a memo recording app, which we can use. We can record ourselves giving feedback to a response or an assignment, and we can send this recording to the student to listen to. There is another software that's available online called Screencast-Matic, and it's basically just a desktop screen saving app where you can record yourself looking at a PPT and talking about what's on there. In terms of the feedback, what I tend to do is I tend to have a student's essay response on the computer. I begin using Screencast-O-Matic. I record my desktop, and I can read through the essay and identify areas where the student perhaps did something that can be improved on. Now, last year when I was teaching online for most of the second semester, one-to-one meetings was probably the most effective thing when it comes to online teaching. Now, this depends on a few things. Number one, it depends how large is your cohort. And also it depends, number two, what software is available for you, or which mediums of communication is available for you to talk to your students. Where I work, quite a lot of schools do use WeChat as a form of communication between class supervisors and the homerooms, and the same thing for teachers. Now, my students particularly appreciated the one-to-one meeting, because in a classroom, if you have a day that is dedicated to writing, that's also usually a day where you're able to meet with individual students and have conversation with them, discuss how they did in a past assignment, discuss how their performance has been for the week. And this is something that we kind of lost with the online learning. So I do recommend that as you're organizing your weekly schedule for online learning, that you do try to find time to fit one-on-one meetings with students. Now, the recommendations I have at the bottom are actually recommendations for feedback, and some of them are also recommendations for how to assess the student learning. A peer review is a great way for students to get feedback, where they have their classmates providing the feedback. Again, this can be very easily done on a learning management system, such as Schoology. We can actually pair students together in different groups. They could share and upload documents, and they could comment on these. 2 stars and a wish is a great way to give feedback, particularly when you don't want it to be misinterpreted and you do not want to sound harsh. You know, I liked this, I like that. This is something I think that would make it better, right? Quite simple. Yellow box is actually a very incredible tool you can use, particularly with writing. And since our history students do a lot of writing, I think this might be invaluable to you as a teacher. Now, one thing I noticed with many history teachers is that a lot of times they do not give students the opportunity to retry writing something, okay? This is something I kind of learned a lot when I watched a lot of math and science lessons. When a child is working on a particular calculation for math, to move beyond the problem until they can figure out what was the issue that he or she had. Well, guess what? We should be trying to use a similar approach when it comes to essay writing. If a student is unable to use an appropriate piece of evidence, whether it's for the paper 1B question to prove a reason why something happened, or even the AS paper 2B question, also the why question, like list causation. If they're unable to provide or use an appropriate piece of evidence, only to select it, then you can use the yellow box strategy, where you highlight this section of that paragraph. You give the student a little bit of feedback and have them try it again, okay? Have them rewrite only that section. And I think this is really going to help a lot of students, giving them the opportunity to go back and actually retry writing this specific section of an essay or a response is really going to make them realize what you are looking for, and even what is the assessments looking for, what is the mark scheme looking for. Comment only grading is actually very good as well. But again, refer back to the first point I made about be a little careful with written feedback, because sometimes it can be misinterpreted. But comment only marking is quite different compared to you mark a few responses of paper 1, but maybe you only write the level and the score, right? Okay, you got level 4, 4 out of 6. And we're comment only marking or comment only grading, you're really focusing much more on giving the student very specific feedback, okay? You are probably around this level because you did or you didn't, okay? And so these are great tools you can use to have students really understand what you're looking for. And again, I think comment only marking is something that is not only specific to online learning, but it's specific just to teaching in general, whether it's also in class as well. Now, I want to get into the last part of my presentation, which is about ideas and best practices, especially when it comes to bridging online teaching and learning when you're going to return back to school. Now, in my opinion, using technology to flip the lessons once you return back to school is a great way to continue using the resources and skills that you have acquired and learned, and that the students have acquired and learned during online teaching to enhance teaching in a physical classroom setting. Learning management systems are a very effective way to provide the resources to preview before lessons. And it's also a great way to create meaningful assessments. In a lot of learning management systems today, you can create quizzes for them, whether or not it is place something in a chronological order or matching vocabulary terms, fill in the blank, true or false. You can even have sections for written responses as well. So you can use the learning management system as a way for the students to really kind of test their understanding of content that they have read, maybe for homework over the weekend or even during the week, okay? I really recommend that you continue to use technology to support learning. You spent a lot of this online learning experience trying to figure out what works best for online learning. When school begins, do not just walk away from it, okay? Use it to continue to support learning. This does not mean that technology is going to take over everything. No, actually, some research has shown that a kind of a combination of teacher-led and also using technology is very important. Technology in the hands of the teacher is important, okay, and effective. It has a massive impact on student learning. The last one I said here is make sure that the resources generated during the online experience are relevant to students as they return. And for this point here, I want to go back to something I mentioned in a previous slide about, for example, making resources or videos where you are explaining difficult content or even modeling skills, because now students will be able to have these as a resource to use even when you return to school, okay? At this stage, I want to say thank you very much for listening to this presentation. It's been a pleasure to present to you some of my ideas about online learning and how you can connect this to some topics in history. And I believe at this time, we will begin to take some questions.
Hi, thank you very much, Nicholas. So yes, we will proceed on to the question and answers. Just starting off the Q&A session is a question from Helny. During online learning, in your opinion, Nicholas, are all students required to have their videos on? And how do we explain using share screen when we can't see all the students' faces?
Now, in regards to having the students have their videos on, I think this largely depends on you as a teacher. For example, there are some teachers I know who do not prefer to have the video on because they believe it adds a little more distraction. There are teachers who actually prefer having the videos on, because guess what? It's a chance for your students to interact with each other and see their friends once again. And I'm pretty sure being sometimes isolated at home, not being able to be with their classmates and friends, I think having the video on it could actually make the overall environment of the online learning a lot more positive.
Great, thank you very much. And I will hand over the Q&A session to our colleague, Lavanya Ganison. Lavanya, over to you, please.
Thank you, Salisa. Hi, Nicholas. Just a few more there.
So
they were asking, some of them asking, how is the use of what does the use of LMS means?
Okay, so LMS means a learning management system. And the ones I mentioned to you, actually, if you look at Doanne Morcillo's response, she kind of listed the ones that I mentioned in the presentation as well. So learning management system, basically, it looks very similar to a social network website where students create a profile, they can have a photo, but really it's an area where a teacher can design a class. You upload activities, You upload resources. Students can view these activities. They can view the resources that you give them. On the side of the LMS, they'll see deadlines for submitting certain activities. So basically, you could think of it as a virtual classroom, where in a regular class where students maybe have a response in a notebook, and you have a place in your classroom where students put their notebooks when they finish an assignment. It's the same thing, but online instead, where you are providing basically you have a virtual place where you can post resources, post assignments, post quizzes. You can make discussions where students can comment on a question, even comment on what each other said. So that is a learning management system, and they're very effective. The one that I currently use is called Schoology. The main reason we use Schoology is because it can be linked to PowerSchool's gradebook, and my school uses PowerSchool for recording students' information. But there's also ones like Edmodo as well, EDMODO. So again, you can go online, look up different learning management systems, and find one and see what works best for you. Almost all of them are free to use. All you need is an email to start an account.
Thanks, Nicholas. A bit more. What kind of online assessment platforms are highly effective for AS and A-level history?
Online learning platform assessments. Well, again, you know, if in my webinar, I did say that a lot of the assessments you should really try to make for yourself. Again, when it comes to like which assessments are most effective, that largely depends on what skill you're trying to teach your student. I'm not going to say that a certain platform or a certain way of providing this resource is more effective than another. You have to find what's best for you and your students. You know your students better than I do. All right. And so, for example, when I have an A-level course where we're trying to break down a very complex question, go back to that question I gave as the example about really the causation of the globalization of the Cold War. One thing that I did on my LMS, on my learning management system for that class, was I posted it as a discussion. And I asked students to not look at the given factor, which was the American policy of containment, but I wanted them to find other factors. And that was a very challenging assignment for them because, like I said during the webinar, a lot of students, when they're in A2, chances are the textbooks don't make the connections to those big picture questions they can see in paper 4. Is going to take a lot more thinking out of the box. And so LMS, I use a learning management system. I did a discussion activity, and I found it very important for students beginning to break down those very challenging paper 4 topics. If you're looking at paper 3 historiography, especially if you're introducing historiography as a topic, I actually recommend that you have the students look at videos of historians giving lectures. For example, John Lewis Gaddis. There are a lot of videos online of him giving lectures about the causes of the Cold War, the origins and causes of the Cold War. And I think this could be a really useful way to, you give them a link on the LMS system, give them a video to watch, have discussion questions available for them to discuss on the learning management system. And it's a great way to engage with those 2 topics. So there are 2 ideas, one for paper 3 and one for paper 4.
Thanks, Nicholas. A few more. Shima has asked, Kahoot is a great online tool to access children's in junior school. They get really excited. Can this be used for senior school as well?
Kahoot. Yeah. Actually, I do use Kahoot as well. Honestly, there's so many things you can use. Kahoot is one, Quizlet's another. And, you know, I'll be very honest, even in senior school, I think students still love and appreciate Kahoot. A lot of times when we think about Kahoot, it's almost like an online game kind of, right, where they kind of compete against one another. But honestly, I think older students really do enjoy that as well. Again, listen, I think you need to judge your students in terms of, you know, whether or not you think this is something they're going to appreciate in a lesson. But yes, I do think Kahoot can be effective. I've used in the past, especially with AS students, and it still worked very well in lessons.
Thanks, Nicholas. Rima has asked, what drawing pad could you recommend if they're a free whiteboard they can use for online classes? They're using Google Classroom.
You know what? I wish I could answer this question for you. However, I personally felt the drawing pad was not my style. And for that reason, I didn't use it. So I apologize, I cannot give you advice in this question. My apologies.
The next one, could you suggest some ways on how they can correct papers?
Suggest ways how they can correct papers. So again, if you look at that yellow box suggestion you gave before, instead of maybe having a student rewrite the entire response, perhaps you want to focus on one particular area. Okay, whether it's if they're selecting appropriate pieces of evidence for like a paper 1B question at IGCSE or an A question at paper 2 for AS. So I recommend, like, when it comes to like students like correcting what they've written, I do recommend you make the corrections a lot smaller usually than rewrite the essay over again, because then you could actually really narrow down on something that can be a weakness for this individual student.
Right, thanks, Nicholas. Sam has also asked, I would like to ask how can I prepare the IGCSE students for ATP paper 6 in online classes?
Sorry, where is that question?
It's by Sadia. She's asking, how can I prepare IGCSE students for ATP paper 6 in online classes?
ATP paper 6. Now, my apologies. I'm not really familiar with what ATP paper 6 is. I know when it comes to IGCSEs, I simply have students complete papers 1, 2, either to do coursework or paper 4. So I'm not very clear what ATP paper 6 is. So again, my apologies. I don't know what that is.
Thanks. How long is the radio presentation assessment?
Radio presentation, this is something that is kind of up to you. I don't, usually in the past, I've limited to anywhere from 6 to 8 minutes. So students are recording in an MP3 this project. I don't think they should go too long. I think 6 to 8 minutes is fine. It's more than enough time to be able to introduce the event.
Right. Ashika has said, you have mentioned that assessment like students make their own political cartoon, a radio story, family story during the time the event was taking place. These are really good, but could you suggest some more and share a few examples of what instructions were shared?
You're talking about instructions for the family project?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, so for the family project, instructions I gave them, okay. When it came to the family project, what I told students was that they have a choice of a topic within the chapter. At the time when we were in the China-Japan chapter, I believe we were at the beginning of the Civil War, the Chinese Civil War. And I recommended, and it is here, I said you can pick a key event from this section of the chapter, and you can interview your parents, not about what do you know about the event, but where was our family while this event was taking place? And it really led the students to, number one, kind of sometimes even engaging with their families for the first time in a discussion that maybe they haven't had before. And it led to like a lot of really interesting family stories being found out. So I think the students really enjoyed it. In terms of other instructions I gave them, I said, interviews must be recorded, okay? If you are not using English as the language, as the medium language, please provide subtitles as well for this discussion. I did give a time limit on how long I want the videos to be. I also requested that the students begin by introducing which key events from the chapter they chose to kind of be the driving force behind the family interview. And also have them write a reflection about what did this project mean to them? What did they learn from it, you know? And also not just about the event, but also about their appreciation for history.
Thanks, Nicholas. One more. Could you suggest some good videos to introduce Cold War?
Good videos to introduce the Cold War. I do know in the past that some students have gone on YouTube and they looked at videos. I think it's called like what was it? Critically History or Thinking Critically. There's a lot of videos online for introducing the Cold War. And I think those are great starting points as well. I think also in terms of the Cold War as well, particularly when you're in A2, kind of delving into the historiography is a really great one. If you are doing paper 3, the historiography of the Cold War, there's a lot of great videos of historians either debating against each other, but also just introducing a very new, unique argument. There is a video also on the First World War, because actually the First World War is going to be a new topic added for the upcoming paper 3s in the new syllabus. And there are videos on there of like a panel discussing different angles for the historiography behind the causes of the First World War. I hope that answers your question. There's a lot of resources on YouTube available to you. I think when it comes to selecting videos, do not pick something long, make it short, okay? The longer the video, the harder it is for the student to kind of feel motivated to keep watching it. I find that videos under 5 minutes are usually best.
Thanks, Nicholas. One last question with one comment from Doan. Doan has mentioned that if you're using Zoom, there is a free whiteboard provided. You may also use Teammates because it embeds a free whiteboard as well, video conference via Zoology and so on. So thanks, Doan, for that. And one last question. Can you please tell how they can help prepare students for IGCSE 9 and 10 for paper 2, source-based paper?
Where's that question?
By Rupanjali at the top. I'll repeat. Can you please tell me how I can?
Yeah. Sorry.
Thanks.
Can you repeat that, please? Apologies.
No problem. Can you please tell how they can help prepare students for IGCSE 9 and 10 for paper 2, source-based paper?
Source-based question papers. Now the source-based paper questions, I think it largely depends on like what type of question it is. If you look at paper 2, there's a lot of different types of questions. Sometimes the students like how similar or different are the two sources, compare and contrast the sources, when was it, why was this source published at this time? So I think when it comes to like a paper 2, I found the best way preparing students for paper 2 is actually number 1, focusing on just the reading skill or even the source, like using the image identification, like for symbols in cartoons or symbols in like posters. Begin with those skills and then later begin to introduce the writing. When it comes to the writing, I think teachers have different ideas about how best to answer these questions. I did know a teacher in the past who was a colleague of mine who actually found it very effective that students actually can create or structure their responses according to the mark scheme, right? Begin your response by probably answering what would be level 1 on the mark scheme, and then building your answer up from there, okay? So as you continue writing, by the very end of your response, you probably hit or you probably reached the top level.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'm afraid we don't have enough time to take all the questions.
Yes, if there are any other questions that I didn't answer, like if they could be sent to me via email, I would love to give more feedback on them.
Thank you so much. So Lisa, back to you.
Thank you very much, Lavanya. Thank you very much, Nicholas, for sharing with us your experience and ideas in today's webinar. I hope everyone has found today's session helpful. Just one last point before we leave. A web browser with the feedback form will pop up on your screen as you leave the session. So it would be great if you can just take about 2 minutes to complete the feedback form. It will most certainly help us improve our future webinars. So again, thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Lavanya, for today's session. And thank you to all attendees for taking time to join us today. So I wish everyone a lovely evening or afternoon. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
Best of luck.